Welcome to Assembly Bethesda On-Air. I am your host, Hayne Fogarty, and today, friends, we are stepping into a passage that absolutely refuses to sit quietly in the background. It demands our attention, it demands our honesty, and frankly, it challenges how we understand justice, how we deal with pain, and even the very character of God. We are diving into Psalm 109, specifically verses 6 through 15. Now, if you've ever read this section of Scripture before, you know it's one of those parts many of us would rather just skip over. It feels incredibly intense, genuinely uncomfortable, and at first glance, it might even feel completely out of place in a faith that we often center on love, grace, and redemption. But here's the thing. Scripture doesn't shy away from the difficult parts of the human experience. It doesn't filter out those raw, unfiltered expressions of the heart. Instead, it invites them into the open, and that's exactly what we're going to explore today.
In this passage, David speaks words that sound, let's be honest, like a direct call for judgment. He's talking about an adversary, someone who has clearly done wrong, someone who has caused significant harm, who has acted with deceit and malice. And instead of responding with some kind of calm, detached composure, David responds with intense emotion. He calls for accountability. He calls for consequences, and he brings all of this directly before God. Now, here is where we absolutely need to slow down and understand what is truly happening. This isn't a man taking revenge into his own hands. This isn't a call to violence carried out by human strength. This, my friends, is a prayer. And that distinction, believe me, matters profoundly. Because what David is doing here is taking everything he feels, every ounce of anger, frustration, and deep desire for justice, and placing it squarely in the presence of God. That, to me, is an incredibly powerful move.
It's so easy for us to pretend that faith requires calmness at all times, isn't it? We often believe that being spiritual means never feeling anger, never expressing frustration. But that's just not what we see here in Psalm 109. What we do see is pure, unfiltered honesty. And not just mild honesty, mind you, but full, raw, unedited honesty. David isn't sitting there editing his emotions before bringing them to God. He's not softening his words to make them sound more acceptable or pious. He's speaking plainly, directly, and intensely. And you know what that tells us? It tells us something incredibly important about the nature of our relationship with God. It tells us that God is not afraid of our honesty. It tells us that we do not have to hide the darker, messier parts of our thoughts when we come before Him. It tells us that faith isn't about pretending. It's about bringing absolutely everything into the light, because He can handle it.
But there's another layer here, one we absolutely cannot ignore. David isn't just expressing emotion. He's expressing a profound belief in justice. He believes that what has been done matters. He believes that wrongdoing isn't invisible. He believes that God sees and that God responds. And in a world where injustice often feels utterly ignored, that belief isn't small. It's significant. When people experience betrayal, when they're lied about, when they're treated unjustly, there's this natural, deep desire for things to be made right. Psalm 109 doesn't deny that desire, it acknowledges it. But instead of turning that desire into personal retaliation, it redirects it toward God. And that, my friends, is where the transformation begins. Because when we try to handle justice on our own, it often becomes distorted. It's driven by emotion, by our limited understanding, by a desire to hurt rather than to restore. But when justice is placed in the hands of God, it's handled by someone who sees fully, understands completely, and judges rightly.
Now, this doesn't mean the language of Psalm 109 becomes easy to read. It's still strong, still intense, and it still raises some really profound questions, doesn't it? How does this fit with the call to love our enemies? How does this align with the beautiful, radical teachings of Jesus? How do we hold these seemingly conflicting truths together? The answer, I believe, isn't found in ignoring one or the other. It's found in understanding that Scripture reveals the fullness of God's character over time in a grand narrative. Psalm 109 shows us the seriousness of sin and the undeniable reality of justice.
The teachings of Jesus show us the incredible depth of mercy and the transformative call to forgiveness. And the cross, friends, that's where these powerful truths ultimately converge and bring everything together. At the cross, justice isn't dismissed, it's completely fulfilled. At the cross, mercy isn't cheap, it is profoundly costly. At the cross, we witness what it truly means for God to deal with sin in a way that is both perfectly just and limitlessly loving.
So, when we read Psalm 109, we're not meant to stop there, are we? We're meant to read it in light of the whole story, the full narrative of God's redemption. And when we do that, something profound shifts. We begin to see that the desire for justice itself isn't wrong, but we also begin to see that the way justice is ultimately carried out, the final judgment, belongs solely to God. And that, my friends, frees us from something significant. It frees us from the immense burden of trying to settle every wrong ourselves. It frees us from carrying resentment endlessly, a weight that can truly crush the spirit. It frees us from the constant need to control outcomes, a battle we can never truly win. Instead, it calls us to something far more powerful. It calls us to trust. And trust, let's be honest, is not easy. It's not passive. It is an active, intentional choice. And it absolutely requires letting go of things we would often rather hold on to.
When we read a passage like this, it's easy to focus outward, isn't it? It's easy to think about the people who have done wrong, to identify the enemy. But Scripture often invites us to look inward as well. And when we do that, the tone, honestly, changes. Because we begin to recognize that we are not always on the side of righteousness. We begin to see moments where we ourselves have acted wrongly. We begin to see areas where we need grace just as much as anyone else. And that realization, friends, brings true humility. It doesn't erase the reality of injustice, but it balances our perspective. It reminds us powerfully that we stand in need of mercy, and that in turn changes how we approach others. It doesn't mean ignoring wrongdoing, no, but it does mean approaching it with a different heart, a heart that understands both justice and grace. As we continue to reflect, it's worth considering how this fits into a broader spiritual landscape. There's a depth here that resonates with what I might call a Gothic expression of faith, not in the sense of despair, but in acknowledging darkness while still holding on to hope.
Psalm 109 does not pretend everything is bright. It doesn't minimize pain, nor does it avoid the reality of evil. Instead, it brings all of that, the darkness, the discomfort, the raw human experience, into direct conversation with God. And that, my friends, is where true transformation begins. Because darkness brought into God's presence doesn't remain unchanged. It is seen, understood, and ultimately addressed. This is where we find grounding, not in difficulty's absence, but in God's unwavering presence within it. As we conclude, here's a simple, powerful takeaway. Bring everything to God. Not just the polished parts, not just the acceptable emotions, but absolutely everything. Faith limited to surface-level expression won't hold in deeper moments, but faith that embraces honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, becomes resilient. It becomes real, and it becomes rooted deeper than circumstances. Psalm 109 invites us into that kind of faith, a faith that doesn't hide, doesn't pretend, but trusts God enough to be truly honest. In that honesty, we find not just an outlet for emotion, but a pathway toward transformation. Thank you for joining me today. God bless, and until next